I missed my flight by 6 minutes, just long enough for the airport to empty and the night to slow down. That's when I saw her, sitting near the glass doors, a baby asleep against her chest, watching me like she already knew my name. This story begins in an airport at dawn, when the lights are too bright and the world feels paused between departures. I was tired, irritated, thinking only about myself and the mistake I'd just made. I didn't know that missing that flight would pull me into someone else's life. Quiet, broken, and far more complicated than it first appeared. The screen above the gate changed quietly. No sound. Just letters shifting. Boarding became closed. I didn't notice at first. I was still walking fast, still believing in momentum. My shoes squeaked against the airport floor like they were apologizing for me. When I finally stopped, the air felt different. Thinner somehow. Like the building had exhaled and left me behind. 6 minutes late. Not enough time to matter. Somehow enough to change everything. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at the gate desk as if it might soften. The agent didn't look up. Her hands moved with practiced kindness, the kind that doesn't bend rules. I didn't argue. I nodded like I understood the world better than I did. I dragged my suitcase a few feet away and sat on it. The plastic was cold through my coat. Around me, the terminal emptied itself. Wheels rolled away. Voices thinned out. A child laughed somewhere distant, then disappeared into echo. Airports always feel temporary, like no one truly belongs there. That night I felt especially misplaced. Check my phone. No new messages. No urgency waiting for me anywhere else. Just time I hadn't planned for. That's when I noticed how quiet it had become. Not silent but low, like a held breath. I lifted my head without knowing why. Across the terminal, near the glass doors where the automatic sensors kept opening and closing, she sat alone. She was wrapped in a thin coat that didn't seem meant for night. Gray, worn at the cuffs. Too light for the cold that slid in every time the doors parted. In her arms a baby slept. Not the restless kind of sleep. The deep, trusting kind. The baby's cheek pressed into her chest, mouth slightly open, one tiny fist gripping the fabric near her collarbone. She rocked back and forth in a slow rhythm, not exaggerated, not desperate. Like she'd done it 1,000 times. Like her body knew the motion even if her mind was tired. I told myself to look away. I didn't. She wasn't asking anyone for anything. No cup. No sign. No shifting glances. Just sitting there, eyes moving gently across the space as people passed without seeing her. The doors opened again. Cold air brushed my ankles. She adjusted the baby's blanket with 2 fingers. Careful. Reverent. I watched longer than I should have. Then, without warning, she looked up. Eyes met. Just for a second. Her gaze wasn't startled. Or pleading. It was steady. Curious, maybe. Like she was noting a detail and storing it away. Then she looked down again. And something in my chest tightened, quietly. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just a moment. Just coincidence. But my body didn't move the way it normally does when something doesn't matter. I stayed seated. The suitcase pressed into my thighs. The overhead lights hummed. I noticed things I hadn't before. How her shoes were scuffed at the toes. How one strap of her bag had been repaired with a knot instead of stitching. How she positioned herself just close enough to the door to feel the warmth when it closed, but not so close that anyone would ask her to move. The baby stirred once. Just a soft sound. She paused the rocking instantly. Rested her cheek against the baby's head. Whispered something I couldn't hear. The doors slid open again. A gust of wind carried in the smell of rain and asphalt. She flinched this time. Just a little. I thought about the flight I'd missed. The hotel I'd planned to sleep in. The clean sheets waiting somewhere else. I thought about how angry I'd been 10 minutes earlier. How important my inconvenience had felt. And suddenly it didn't. That look she gave me, brief, unreadable, it stayed with me. Like she'd passed something to me without touching me. Question maybe. Or a wait. I checked the board again, even though I knew it wouldn't change. The gate light was off now. Final. I didn't stand up right away. Across the terminal, she shifted the baby slightly higher on her chest. The baby sighed in its sleep, a sound so small it almost wasn't real. The automatic doors opened once more. Closed. Opened again. People came and went around her like weather. She stayed. And in that long, quiet stretch of missed plans and borrowed time, I understood something without fully knowing why. Missing that flight wasn't the mistake. Not yet. The mistake would be pretending I hadn't seen her at all. The doors kept opening on their own. Soft mechanical sigh. Cold air slipping in like it didn't belong. Each time they parted, the light outside shifted. Cars passing, headlights cutting thin lines across the floor. She sat just beside that line, close enough to feel the cold, far enough to stay inside. The baby in her arms didn't move, didn't flinch. Just slept, as if the night had promised to hold still for a while. I remember thinking how strange that was. How calm she looked in a place built entirely for leaving. I stayed where I was, perched on my suitcase like it might suddenly roll away without me. My hands rested on the handle, fingers numb from gripping it too long. The terminal lights buzzed overhead, a tired sound like they'd been on too many nights in a row. People still passed through but slower now. The ones who missed something. The ones waiting on something else. Everyone moved with that airport posture. Shoulders forward, eyes ahead, heart somewhere else. She didn't fit into that movement. She was still. Her coat hung open slightly at the collar, the fabric thinning where it folded. Dark hair tucked behind one ear, loose strands catching the light. She leaned back against the glass, not resting fully, just enough to support the weight of the baby. The doors opened again. A man stepped out. The cold followed him in. She adjusted the baby's blanket without looking up. I told myself not to stare, that this wasn't my business. Airports were full of stories that weren't mine to touch. But my eyes kept returning to her, like they were trying to understand something my mind hadn't named yet. She didn't look lost. She didn't look desperate. She looked settled. And that unsettled me. The baby's hand was the first thing I really noticed. It was small, barely wrapped around her finger, like a promise made without words. Every time the doors opened, the baby's grip tightened just a little. Not enough to wake. Just enough to hold on. She rocked gently. Not the exaggerated sway people use when they're nervous. This was quieter, slower, like breathing. A couple walked past her without slowing. A man with a phone pressed to his ear stepped over the edge of her blanket without seeing it. A woman dragging a carry-on glanced down, then away, her face closing like a door. No one stopped. She didn't ask them to. There was no sign. No cup at her feet. No rehearsed look of need. She didn't scan faces the way people do when they're hoping for kindness. She watched the doors. Each time they opened, her eyes lifted slightly. Each time they closed, her shoulders eased. I started to notice the rhythm of it. Open, close, open, close. Felt like waiting. Not for help. For something else. The doors opened wider this time. A rush of voices spilled in. Laughter. A burst of movement. The smell of coffee and rain. The baby stirred. Just a soft whimper. More breath than sound. Her body responded instantly. She leaned forward, curling around the baby, shielding it from the cold. Her chin rested against the baby's head. Her eyes closed for half a second. When she opened them again, she looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day. The deeper kind. The kind that settles into bones. She whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the tone. The one people use when they're reassuring themselves as much as the child. I felt something shift in me then. Quiet discomfort. Like I'd been watching a private moment I hadn't earned. I looked away. The floor stretched out in front of me, scuffed and shining under the lights. My reflection blurred there, broken into pieces by old scratches. I could still see her in the corner of my vision. Still waiting. Still calm. It struck me then, how deliberate her stillness was. How she'd chosen that spot. The warmth when the doors closed. The cold when they opened. The view of people leaving. As if she needed to see them go. Time moved differently after that. Slower. Thicker. The terminal clock ticked forward. But it didn't seem to matter. The doors kept opening. Kept closing. She stayed. The baby slept again. Breath evening out. Fingers loosening but not letting go. I watched her watch the doors. And for the first time I wondered what it meant to wait without asking. To stay visible without calling attention to yourself. To sit in the cold, holding something precious, while the world practiced leaving. She didn't look at me again. But I felt like she knew I was there. And somewhere in that quiet space between us, a question settled in my chest. What was she waiting for? And why did it feel like it was getting closer? The coffee machine made too much noise for how late it was. Grinding, hissing, complaining. I stood there longer than necessary, watching the dark liquid fill the paper cup, the steam rising like it had somewhere better to be. The terminal smelled faintly of burnt beans and floor cleaner. Midnight smells. Waiting smells. I don't remember deciding to bring her coffee. I only remember turning around with the cup in my hands and realizing I was already walking toward her. Up close, she seemed younger than I'd thought. Or maybe just worn in a way that confused time. Her face was calm but not relaxed. Like someone holding themselves together quietly. I slowed my steps, suddenly aware of how this might look. Stranger. Cup of coffee. No reason good enough to explain it. She noticed me before I spoke. Her eyes lifted, not startled, not defensive, just present. I stopped, cleared my throat. The words felt clumsy the moment they left me. Would you like some coffee? She looked at the cup, then at me. The baby slept on, cheek warm against her chest, breath slow and even. Yes, she said. Careful. Her voice didn't rise at the end like a question. Settled. I handed her the cup. Our fingers didn't touch. She wrapped both hands around it like she was measuring the heat. Thank you, she said. She didn't add anything else. I stood there, unsure if the moment was over. Unsure if I should leave or stay. The doors sighed behind her. Cold air brushed past my legs. The baby didn't move. That felt important somehow. She took a small sip. Winced just slightly. Then smiled at herself for it. I always forget how hot it is, she said. Her voice carried the faintest rough edge, like she hadn't used it much that day. I nodded as if that made sense. Silence settled between us. Not heavy. Just there. I'm sorry, I said, gesturing vaguely. I don't usually. She shook her head gently. It's okay. Another sip. Longer this time. The baby's fingers loosened around her coat, then tightened again. She noticed. Adjusted the blanket with one hand without breaking the conversation. She was good at that. Being present in two places at once. My name's, she started. Then stopped. Her eyes shifted just briefly toward the doors. As if checking something. Or someone. It's Mara, she finished. The name landed softly. Like it had been sitting with her a while. I hesitated, then said my name. It sounded louder than I expected. She nodded, committing it to memory. Or maybe just being polite. Another pause. Waited. She didn't rush to fill the silence. That was the thing I noticed most. Some people talk to cover the gaps. She let them exist. I don't usually take things from strangers, she said finally, eyes still on the cup. But tonight felt different. I didn't ask how. I watched the way her thumb traced the rim of the cup, slow and deliberate, as if grounding herself. Each movement seemed chosen. The baby sighed again. Sound like relief. She smiled down at the baby. The smile reached her eyes this time. Just for a second. He sleeps through anything, she said. Always has. There was something in the way she said has. Past tense, but not finished. He nodded. I didn't trust my voice. She took another sip, then held the cup between her palms, not drinking. Warming her hands. I'll be moving soon, she said. It wasn't an invitation for questions. Just a statement. I felt the urge to ask where. When. I didn't. Her eyes lifted again, meeting mine fully this time. There was no fear there. No expectation. Just awareness. She was choosing what to share. And what not to. That carefulness settled into me, slow and heavy. Like I was being trusted with something fragile. Not information but restraint. Closing scene, 100 to 150 words. The coffee grew quiet between us. Steam thinning. Heat fading. She took one last sip and nodded, satisfied. As if the small kindness had done what it was meant to do. "Thank you," she said again. This time it felt like an ending. I stepped back, giving her space. She adjusted the baby once more, rocking gently, eyes returning to the doors. As I walked away, I realized something had changed. Not in her. Me. The terminal looked the same. The lights still buzzed. The clock still moved forward. But now there was a voice behind me I could place. A name I couldn't forget. A conversation that hadn't said much, but had meant more than it should have. I glanced back once. She didn't look up. And somehow that made me certain. Whatever she was waiting for, she was getting closer to it. The sky outside was pale gray, not yet awake. The fluorescent lights of the terminal hummed softly above us. Plastic chairs scraped lightly against the floor when we shifted, a sound that felt louder than it should have. She held the baby on her lap, its small head nuzzled into her chest, breathing steady, even. I sat across from her, hands folded around the strap of my bag. The air smelled faintly of rain on concrete, and the terminal smelled faintly of waiting. We didn't speak at first. We didn't need to. And yet, in that quiet, it felt like a conversation had already begun. Had no plan. No reason to be there, really. My flight had long since left without me, and yet I felt rooted in this space, as if some invisible thread kept me anchored. She shifted slightly, settling the baby against her shoulder. The blanket was thin, but she arranged it like it was armor. Every movement was careful, measured, like she'd been doing it for years. I noticed the worn soles of her shoes against the tile, the fraying cuffs of her coat, the way she avoided looking directly at the fluorescent lights. She wasn't asking for anything. Not money. Not directions. Not even acknowledgement. The silence between us felt deliberate. Not uncomfortable. Not forced. Just real. I told myself to focus on something else. My phone, my bag, the faint hum of the vending machines, but my eyes kept returning to her. And I felt it. A strange, unfamiliar sense of responsibility for someone I had only just met. How could that be? How could the simple act of sharing a space make me feel so accountable? The sky shifted again outside, a touch brighter. Morning coming slowly, quietly. And with it, the weight of knowing someone else's night had been longer, colder, emptier than mine. "I don't have anywhere to go tonight," she said finally. Softly. As if the words themselves might break something delicate. Her voice didn't ask for sympathy. It wasn't bitter. Just factual. I looked down at my hands. Fingers pressed into the fabric of my coat, feeling the warmth I hadn't noticed before. I didn't tell her about my life, my family, my apartment. Only that I had missed my flight. That was the only detail I allowed myself to offer. She nodded, accepting it without comment. The baby stirred lightly. One tiny hand lifted, brushing against her collarbone. She adjusted the blanket without breaking eye contact with the doors. I watched her, noticing how careful she was with each movement. How she preserved the stillness of this moment, even in the chaos of a terminal at dawn. Outside, the sky grew paler, almost white at the horizon. The first birds began to stir somewhere beyond the glass. Their calls were distant and fragile, like whispers meant for no one in particular. We didn't speak for several minutes. But in that quiet it felt intimate. Shared. As if the silence itself was a language we both understood. I realized I wasn't thinking about my missed flight anymore. I was thinking about her. She shifted slightly, turning toward me just enough that I could see her eyes. "They don't have anyone," she said. "No family nearby. No one checking in. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Instead, I watched her hands, how they rested gently on the baby, how her fingers lingered along the soft curve of its cheek, how she adjusted the blanket just enough to shield it from the cold draft slipping under the glass doors. Her eyes met mine briefly, then looked away. She wasn't asking me to stay. She wasn't asking me to help. She was simply sharing. And in that moment I realized why I felt responsible. Not because I had promised anything. Not because I had to. But because she had trusted me in silence, with something I didn't understand. Something fragile. The terminal lights flickered, and for a second I thought I saw the exhaustion settle more heavily on her shoulders. But she straightened just slightly and tucked the baby closer. I understood then that some people carry nights with them that others will never see. Some weights are invisible. Some stories are spoken only to those who choose to listen without speaking. I wanted to ask her about it. About the night, about the people she had or didn't. But I stayed quiet. Let her words hang, let her presence fill the space, let the silence speak. The first gray light of dawn seeped through the glass. It made the terminal look softer, edges blurred. The cold had thinned but lingered in corners. She hummed a soft rhythm to the baby. One I couldn't name. One that felt old as the world, quiet as the morning. I watched, feeling the weight of being a stranger with nothing to offer but a chair across from her. The silence stayed between us. Comfortable, fragile, intimate. Thought of the sky. Pale gray. Endless in its quiet. I thought of the night she had carried. The doors she had waited by. The life folded into her arms. And I realized I couldn't leave yet. Not entirely. Not without carrying some part of it with me. She didn't look at me. But I knew she had said something anyway. Something unspoken. Something I couldn't forget. And I wondered, how much of our lives are shared in moments like this, quietly, before the world notices? The terminal lights flickered faintly, casting long, pale shadows across the floor. The automatic doors hissed open and closed, letting in thin drafts of cold night air. The baby stirred once, tiny fingers curling against her mother's coat. I had no idea what made the words leave my mouth. You could stay at my place, I said before thinking. My voice sounded strange in the quiet, almost alien. I held out nothing but the gesture itself. Spare key. Promised to be back. If warm. And then I wished I could take it back. Her eyes lifted slowly, meeting mine, then dropping again to the baby's sleeping face. I noticed the crease between her brows, subtle, but there. Hesitation. Measurement. Calculating a risk I couldn't see. The terminal felt different somehow. Smaller. Louder. Every creak of the floor sounded sharp. Every distant announcement sounded like a question I wasn't ready to answer. I tried to pretend it was normal. That offering my apartment, a place I barely thought of, was just a casual suggestion. But her gaze, watching the baby's cheek press against her shoulder, the tiny hand wrapped around her finger, made it heavy. I wondered what she imagined might happen if she accepted. What dangers lurked outside these glass doors. What trust she was being asked to place in a stranger. The baby stirred again, soft sighing, and she adjusted the blanket without looking at me. The motion was instinctive, protective, rehearsed. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for her to say yes or no, or nothing. Her silence was more telling than words could ever be. I leaned slightly forward, hands gripping the strap of my bag. You don't have to decide now, I said. But the words felt hollow, even to me. The offer had already been made. The key imagined in my pocket, the promise of a warm apartment, the thought of her carrying the baby there. All of it was out, loose in the air. She rocked the baby gently, her movements careful, deliberate. I watched the curve of her shoulder, the small shifts she made to keep the blanket tucked. Her fingers brushed the baby's cheek, tracing a line I could only imagine meant reassurance. I don't usually, she began, voice small, and then paused. The baby stirred again, eyelids fluttering. She whispered something low, almost a murmur, and the tiny fist relaxed against her coat. I realized then how significant the pause was. How much thought went into each word, each movement. She was weighing not just my offer but the safety of someone else. Someone entirely dependent on her. The terminal around us faded. The hum of lights. The distant rolling of bags. All of it disappeared until all I could see was her and the small rhythm of life in her arms. She didn't look at me. Not fully. And yet, I felt the weight of her decision pressing on me. Her eyes lifted just for a moment to meet mine. There was something there. Not trust. Not surrender. Something more cautious, deliberate, measured. Then she nodded. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly. My stomach twisted. Relief and fear tangled together. Relief that she might have a safe place tonight. Fear that I had just invited something I wasn't ready to control. I felt the key in my pocket suddenly heavier, as if it carried the responsibility of her trust. My apartment, empty and warm, suddenly seemed too fragile, too small, too exposed. She adjusted the baby's blanket again. The little hand stayed curled, pressing against her finger, a silent rhythm of trust. And I realized that her acceptance wasn't casual. It was deliberate. A choice that balanced necessity and caution. I wanted to say something comforting. Something that wouldn't break the fragile calm we'd built. But the words stuck in my throat. The terminal lights flickered once more, and the distant hum of cleaning machines broke the quiet. I looked at the floor, at my shoes, at the bag between us, anything to avoid the raw weight of what had just happened. And still in the silence I knew. I had opened a door. Not just the literal one to my apartment, but one I couldn't close. The baby sighed, a sound so small it could almost have been imagined. She held the blanket tighter, tucked it over the tiny shoulders. Her eyes were lowered, tracing the baby's form, checking and rechecking. I slid my hand slightly into my pocket, brushing the key, feeling the cold metal against my fingers. A simple object, yet suddenly heavy with trust, risk, and unspoken questions. The terminal doors hissed again, letting in a brief draft. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. She simply continued holding the baby, steady, calm, deliberate. I wanted to believe this would be enough. That the apartment, the warmth, the key, the promise would be what she needed. And yet, deep down, I knew it wasn't certainty I had given her. Only a chance. She nodded again, tiny, careful, almost imperceptible. And I realized the quiet truth. Kindness is never simple. And sometimes it comes with a weight you aren't prepared for. The hallway smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and the faint metallic tang of rain on concrete. The door loomed in front of us, the pale light from the lobby spilling across the floor. She stopped, one hand on the handle, the other cradling the baby. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Her eyes lingered on the corridor, tracing the walls, the small cracks in the paint, the shadow where the ceiling light didn't quite reach. Like she was memorizing every inch. Thank you, she said quietly, voice steady, tired, careful. I nodded, feeling the air in my chest tighten. This was the threshold. The moment the world outside and the world I claimed collided. I had never imagined giving someone a key would feel like this. The apartment smelled faintly of old wood and detergent, a quiet warmth that was mine and mine alone. Felt safe, private. And now, somehow it belonged, at least for a night, to her. I stepped aside, letting her enter first. She did, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes swept the hallway, then the small living room, lingering over the bare walls, the clean lines of the furniture. She didn't touch anything, didn't move too fast. Her caution made me realize how exposed my world had become. I left a stack of clean blankets on the sofa, folded neatly, the edges sharp. Small comforts. My number written on a scrap of paper, placed carefully on top. She glanced down, nodded at the paper. Then she looked back up, eyes meeting mine. A silent question passed between us. Will I be safe here? Can I trust this stranger? The baby yawned, stretching one tiny hand. She adjusted the blanket, smoothing it around the child, keeping it warm. Her focus on the small, vulnerable life she carried made me feel the weight of my own gesture. The key, the apartment, the trust. The lock clicked behind me, a sound louder than it should have been. I stood in the hallway, letting it echo in my ears. That click carried more than security, it carried choice, risk, exposure. Why did giving away my key feel like crossing a line I couldn't uncross? I had offered safety, warmth, a place to rest. And yet it felt like I had opened a door I wasn't ready to open, both literally and inside myself. She hadn't said much. Hadn't asked for anything beyond a temporary place. But the act of letting her in, even for a night, made me aware of how fragile our boundaries are, how quickly trust can slip through walls and locks and turn into responsibility. I pressed my hand against the cool metal of the door, imagining her movements inside. Adjusting blankets, rocking the baby, moving slowly through a space that had always been mine alone. I wanted to stay, to make sure she was truly safe. But I knew that my presence could change everything. So I left. And yet, I carried the weight of her decision as if it had been made for me too. The hallway smelled faintly of rain again, distant and metallic. I walked slowly, every step echoing, feeling the quiet hollow of absence where the apartment had been. The key in my pocket felt heavier than metal. I thought of her, of the baby, of the way she had paused, memorized, measured every inch. I thought of the trust she had placed in me without words. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn brushing against the city. I looked up briefly, imagining them inside, small and fragile, surrounded by warmth I had offered but couldn't guard. The lock had clicked. The apartment was hers for now. And I realized something I hadn't expected. Sometimes giving is also letting go. I didn't look back. But I knew the key, the door, the choice. They weren't just hers anymore. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. The hum of the heater filled the corners, a low, constant vibration against the walls. I lay on the couch, phone in hand, staring at the dark screen. Every minute felt like hours. Outside, the city had gone silent, the usual hum of traffic and distant sirens replaced by an almost sacred stillness. I pressed my thumb against the screen again. Nothing. No message. Nothing. The blankets I had left neatly for her were folded in my mind, untouched, imagined warmth lying somewhere beyond this quiet. I told myself I'd done the right thing. And yet, the pit in my stomach refused to settle. I sat upright, the couch creaking beneath me. The room smelled faintly of coffee from the morning, mingled with the faint must of the apartment's closed windows. My thoughts circled endlessly, like a record stuck on a single note. What if she had needed more than I had given? What if something had gone wrong? My key, the space I considered safe. What if it wasn't safe enough? I checked the phone again. The screen was black. Nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just worry. Natural, human, a small echo of care. But my mind refused to stop. I imagined her rocking the baby, adjusting the blanket, listening for noises that weren't there. I imagined the tiny hand curled around hers, holding her steady, trusting her completely. The city outside remained quiet. Even the occasional hum of the subway beneath the streets seemed absent tonight. The quiet felt deliberate, almost accusing, like it was holding me responsible for some invisible fault I could not see. I told myself I'd done the right thing. That offering warmth, a place to rest, and the key was enough. And yet my chest felt tight, heavy, as if waiting for something I couldn't name. I got up and walked to the window, pressing my palms against the glass. The streets below were empty, glistening with the residue of earlier rain. Reflections of streetlights shimmered in puddles, distorted by the faint ripple of wind. Every shadow looked like someone waiting, someone watching. My mind played tricks. I imagined the baby crying. I imagined her standing at the door, hesitating, unsure. I imagined me returning too late, imagining warmth that wasn't there anymore. I sat back down, pulling my knees close. The blankets on the couch reminded me of her hands, her careful movements, the way she had measured every step in my apartment. I thought of the trust she had placed in me. Stranger. And I wondered if I had fully understood it. The phone vibrated once, or maybe it hadn't. I jumped, heart hammering, and pressed the screen. Nothing. The silence returned immediately, more suffocating than before. I told myself again. I did a good thing. Kind thing. Something real. But the feeling lingered, a subtle gnawing weight at the edge of my mind. Like a warning. Or a memory I hadn't yet remembered. I tried to focus on breathing. In and out, counting slowly. The room felt smaller with every passing minute, the walls pressing closer. I imagined her moving in the apartment, placing the baby gently on the couch, settling into the small comfort I had offered. I imagined her looking around, memorizing everything as she had done before, the weight of care in every gesture. And then I realized. The worry wasn't about danger. Not exactly. It was about absence. About the unknown. About trusting someone with pieces of my world and not knowing what they might do with them. The phone remained dark. My chest ached. And yet the city outside continued its uncanny stillness. I thought about the key in my pocket, the scraps of paper, the blankets folded neatly. The weight of those small objects suddenly felt immense. They weren't just objects, they were symbols, promises, possibilities. And somewhere in the quiet, I understood that care always carried risk. That kindness was never simple. That offering safety sometimes meant living with the fear that it might not be enough. The night pressed on, silent and deliberate. I sat there, listening to the faint rhythm of my own heartbeat, imagining hers beside me in a distant space. Eventually I lay back down on the couch. Eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The heater hummed softly. Shadows moved gently across the walls. I imagined her rocking the baby to sleep again. Imagined the blankets surrounding them, warm and soft. Imagined her resting, safe, for just a few hours. And yet, the gnawing feeling didn't leave. A subtle awareness that I had missed something. Or that something was still to come. The city slept outside, holding its breath, quiet as a secret. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the faint rhythm of fear, of hope, of responsibility, all tangled together. I whispered to the darkness, though I knew it wouldn't answer. I hope you're okay. And in that hope, in the silence, the night stretched on. Waiting. Watching. Holding us both in its still, fragile hands. The key turned in the lock too easily. The door swung open. And the hallway smelled faintly of rain, warm bread, and something I couldn't name. Inside the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Some things were where I had left them. The stack of blankets on the sofa, the scrap of paper with my number still tucked neatly on top. But other things weren't. The air had shifted. Heavy in corners, light in others, carrying a trace of her presence. The baby's small rhythm, the careful way she had moved, seemed to linger in every shadow. I stepped inside slowly, groceries in hand, rehearsing apologies I wasn't sure she needed, but that I certainly did. The kitchen smelled faintly of cereal and coffee, though I hadn't brewed any. The living room looked normal at first glance. The couch cushions were slightly disturbed, the blankets no longer perfectly folded. I set the bags down on the counter, the soft thud of paper and plastic louder than I expected. The refrigerator hummed. The small clock on the wall ticked in the background. I wondered where she was. The silence was unsettling, as if the apartment had held its breath while I was gone. My presence felt intrusive, like I was stepping into a world I had only partially been invited into. I moved slowly, noticing the small traces of life. A diaper bag leaning against the sofa, a tiny sock draped over the armrest, a single boot tucked beneath the table. Each object suggested movement, decisions made in my absence. I felt the weight of the key in my pocket. It had been a simple gesture, a way to offer warmth and safety, but now it carried questions I wasn't prepared to answer. The apartment felt alive without me, yet fragile. I realized I hadn't expected to feel this way, responsible, anxious, and slightly afraid all at once. I walked toward the sofa, noticing the blanket had been moved slightly, the edges rumpled. The scrap of paper with my number was still there, but the handwriting on it seemed different somehow, as if the apartment itself had touched it. I set the groceries on the counter and took a careful look around. The baby's blanket, the small pile of folded clothes, the careful arrangement of the couch. It was her order, not mine. She had navigated my space, left traces of her presence, and vanished without a sound. I called softly, "Hello." My voice echoed against the walls. No answer. The room felt charged, like it had absorbed her life, even briefly. I noticed faint impressions on the sofa where the baby had rested, tiny indentations left in the blankets, the soft weight of her absence pressing against the floorboards. I wanted to imagine her asleep, the baby nestled against her chest, safe in the warm apartment I had offered. And yet, the silence made it impossible. I moved to the hallway, peering down the corridor. Shadows stretched long, familiar objects now slightly unfamiliar. The air seemed to vibrate with the traces of her care, the careful folding, the tiny adjustments, the quiet movement through space. Each detail made the apartment feel less like mine and more like a shared story I had yet to understand. I sank into the sofa, the cushions soft beneath me, and let my hands rest in my lap. The groceries sat untouched, as if I had no right to touch them yet. Her absence felt deliberate yet intimate. The apartment had been hers for a night, even without her physically present. I realized then that trust had passed through this space, leaving traces that couldn't be erased. The careful movements, the unspoken choices, the quiet awareness of a small life in her hands. The scrap of paper caught my eye again, and I remembered the folded blankets, the key I had left, the small gestures meant to offer comfort. I wondered if she had noticed the same things I had, my attempts at order, my care in small details. And in that realization, I felt a strange mixture of relief and intrusion. Relief that she had been safe, intrusion that I had glimpsed a life I was not meant to fully understand. I stood, moving slowly through the apartment. Each object, each displaced blanket, each faint trace of movement was a reminder that she had been here, present, cautious, alive. I thought of the baby, the soft weight in her arms, the quiet authority of her presence. And I understood something about giving trust. Once it passes into someone else's hands, it can't be reclaimed. I left the groceries on the counter and walked to the door, pausing to glance back. The apartment was quiet again, but it carried the memory of her presence in every shadow, every soft indentation in the blankets, every faint trace on the floor. The key in my pocket felt heavier than it had before. A simple object, yes, but also a token of responsibility I hadn't fully anticipated. Outside, the city was quiet, unusually so. The hum of distant traffic, the occasional siren. It all seemed muted, respectful. I closed the door halfway, leaving it slightly ajar, a small invitation for what might come next. And I realized, even when someone is gone, their life leaves a mark on the spaces they touch. The apartment was mine again. And yet somehow it wasn't. A presence lingered, silent, waiting. And I wondered what story would unfold when she returned. The sunlight came in soft, pale streaks through the blinds, dust motes floating in slow arcs across the floor. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee, leftover warmth from the morning, and something faintly metallic, like the echo of a presence that had already left. On the kitchen table, a folded piece of paper caught my eye. It wasn't there yesterday. Or had I just not noticed it? I reached for it slowly, fingers trembling slightly, the paper crisp beneath my touch. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, each curve measured, each word weighted with intent. I unfolded it and read the first line. "Thank you." And then, like a whisper too late, the weight of everything she had carried settled in the apartment. I sank into the kitchen chair, the seat cold against my legs. The note lay flat on the table, the edges slightly curled, as if it had been left with the thought that I would notice. Her words were polite, but beneath the surface, I sensed an undertone of something unsaid. A history, a caution, a goodbye disguised as thanks. Each line pressed gently against the spaces in the room, the silence carrying it. I traced the words with my eyes, hesitant to touch too much, as if handling them roughly would break the fragile rhythm they held. The apartment felt different now, larger, emptier, and yet weighted by the echo of her choices. I noticed details I hadn't before. A faint crease in the sofa where the baby had rested, a small dent in the counter from her elbow, a tiny sock left near the table. Small, intimate things. movements that belonged to her, now lingering like fingerprints on my world. And then I saw it, a small detail in the note, one she hadn't mentioned aloud. Something about her past, a hint of a life I hadn't known. Something that didn't add up with the story she had shared. Why did the truth arrive only after she was gone? I stood, moving slowly through the apartment, the note in one hand, the other brushing against objects she had touched. The blankets I had left neatly folded were now slightly rumpled. The kitchen counters, the sofa, the small chair she had sat on, they all carried traces of her presence. I read the note again, aloud this time, softly, to the empty room. Thank you for the warmth, the safety, the kindness. I won't forget this. And yet, beneath the words, I felt an undertone of departure, of inevitability. Not all stories were meant to stay. Not all trust could be captured in a single gesture. I noticed the detail that didn't add up. A name written in the corner, a small reference to someone she had never mentioned, a hint of movement, of life, outside of the apartment, outside of the world I had glimpsed. The baby's presence had been real, her care had been real, but this small hint reminded me. I had known only a fraction of her story, only the pieces she chose to share. I folded the note carefully and placed it back on the table. The apartment felt different now, alive with what had been and what was hidden, a presence felt in absence. I moved to the window and pressed my hand against the glass. Outside, the city continued in its slow rhythm. Cars, footsteps, distant voices, but it felt faint, almost insignificant compared to the quiet inside. The note had shifted something. Not the apartment, not the space, but the way I understood her. Her presence had been gentle, careful, and precise. Her story, like the note, left gaps I could not fill, questions I was not meant to answer. I thought about the trust one had given her, the warmth, the key, the small gestures that felt monumental. I realized then that sometimes giving isn't about knowing the end. Sometimes it's about holding the space, offering safety, and letting someone else carry their life through it in their own way. The small detail in the note, the name, the hint, the fragment of something she hadn't told me, reminded me that people are always larger than the space we occupy in their lives. That absence does not erase presence. That trust leaves marks we cannot predict. I sat back down at the table, the note before me, sunlight hitting the ink. My chest felt tight, full of questions and gratitude, wonder and uncertainty. I realized the truth had arrived only after she was gone because that's when I was ready to see it. I left the note on the table and stepped back, letting the light spill across it. The apartment was quiet again, but it felt different, charged with memory, with presence, with the weight of what had passed through it. I thought of her, of the baby, of the careful movements and the quiet trust. The small detail that hadn't fit before now felt like a key to understanding that some stories are never fully told. The city outside continued in its distant rhythm, unaware of the tiny universe of trust, care, and subtle revelation that had unfolded here. I pressed my fingers to the table, feeling the faint indentation of the paper beneath my palm. And I whispered softly to the empty apartment, "Thank you." Some truths only arrive after someone leaves. And some presences never truly go. The sunlight hit the apartment in a slow, gray wash, filtering through the blinds in thin stripes. I sat at the kitchen table, the note folded neatly beside me, coffee gone cold in the mug. I looked around at the space she had moved through, the blankets slightly rumpled, a tiny sock on the floor, the faint indentation of where the baby had rested. Each detail pressed against me like a memory I hadn't fully understood. I could feel it now, the faint pulse of her life left behind. Not chaos, not desperation, but careful calculation. A rhythm I hadn't noticed until she was gone. I realized slowly, painfully. I had assumed the wrong story. And understanding was always too late. The apartment felt heavy with silence, yet alive in a way that startled me. I moved from room to room, noticing small traces she had left. A blanket tucked under the sofa, the diaper bag leaning in the corner, the baby's bottle still warm in a thermos I hadn't touched. Each object carried a story, gesture, a decision, and I began to see them not as signs of helplessness, but as signs of careful survival. I thought about her eyes, Steady, measured, cautious. The way she had weighed every word she spoke. The way she had moved through my apartment, arranging, adjusting, leaving just enough for me to recognize her presence but never enough to know her fully. I realized that what I had assumed was homelessness was something else entirely. She wasn't without protection. She had chosen this life as a shield. The baby wasn't in danger. That had never been the risk. The danger was elsewhere, invisible to me. And yet I had offered my warmth, my key, my apartment. Small gestures of kindness that had shifted her path. Without realizing it, I had become part of her plan, part of the way she could disappear safely from the world she was fleeing. I walked to the window and pressed my palms against the glass. Outside, the city moved in muted rhythms, cars, footsteps, distant voices, but it felt irrelevant. Inside, the traces she left felt more urgent than the noise beyond the walls. I picked up the small sock from the floor and held it in my hand, imagining the tiny weight of the baby, the careful hands that had held her, the quiet decisions made to keep them both safe. Each object was a clue, each movement a message. I started to piece things together. The precise folds of the blankets, the way the note had been written, the small items placed intentionally, the absence of things she could have taken. She hadn't left in haste. She had left on her own terms. I thought about the key I had given her. My apartment, my safety, my trust. Used not for comfort alone, but as a tool for her survival. I wondered if she had looked back at the space I had offered, memorized it, and then left knowing she could return if she needed. And in that moment I felt a complicated mixture. Pride that I had helped, guilt that I hadn't understood, relief that the baby had been safe, and the sharp sting of realizing my assumptions had been wrong. I sat back down at the kitchen table, staring at the folded note. The weight of understanding pressed down like a heavy fog. I finally saw the story she had been telling through objects, gestures, and silence, not through words. She hadn't been lost. She had been hiding, protecting herself, protecting the baby. The small movements, the careful organization, the measured speech, they weren't signs of weakness. They were shields. I remembered every detail. Her hesitation when I offered coffee, the way she measured every word, the way she paused before accepting my key. She had been calculating, cautious, and wise beyond what I had seen. And I realized that my kindness, small though it was, may have given her the exact thing she needed. A chance to vanish without fear, a space to breathe, to exist without being found. I hadn't known her story, but somehow I had helped her write the next chapter on her own terms. The apartment felt emptier than ever, though the traces of her presence lingered. I could almost hear the faint rhythm of her steps, the tiny breath of the baby, the careful adjustments of her life carried forward elsewhere. Understanding had arrived too late. And yet it arrived at all. I placed the note back on the table and stood, moving slowly through the apartment one last time. The blankets, the toys, the small items she had left behind, they were relics of a story I could only glimpse. Outside, the city moved on in muted, endless rhythm. Inside, I felt the quiet impact of someone else's life passing through mine. A presence I had seen but not fully known, leaving only traces, lessons, and gratitude in its wake. I pressed my fingers to the paper, imagining the baby's tiny hand curled around hers, imagining her moving through the world, careful, invisible, safe. And I whispered to the empty apartment, to the absent space, to the invisible story. I hope you are safe. Some truths only reveal themselves when the person has already gone. Some kindness is understood only in hindsight. And some presence lingers, quietly, forever. The airport smelled of stale coffee and polished floors. Announcements droned overhead, blending into the steady rhythm of rolling suitcases. People moved quickly, faces blurred, voices distant, each person carrying their own urgency. I sat near gate 12, watching them pass, my hands folded over a cold cup of coffee. A baby cried somewhere behind me, small and urgent, and I froze, hearing her voice in that sound. For a moment I was back there, the thin coat, the gentle rhythm of rocking, the quiet weight of trust in my hand. Some encounters are brief, invisible to the rest of the world. Some moments shape you in ways you never see coming. The terminal felt empty and crowded at the same time. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, reflecting on the polished tile floors. People rushed past me, some checking watches, others hugging loved ones, and still others moving alone, heads down, lost in thought. I held my boarding pass loosely, though I had no flight to catch. I came back for routine, for familiarity, for a reason I wasn't ready to name. I thought about her constantly. The calm she carried, the patience in her movements, the way she had measured every word before speaking. And the baby, always safe in her arms, always quiet under her care. My chest tightened at the memory. The memory was a quiet weight, settling into me like dust on old wood. I realized that her presence had changed something inside me. How I saw kindness, how I offered trust, how I measured generosity. I hadn't known then what I was giving, or what I was receiving. A mother rushed past, carrying a baby in a pink blanket. The infant's cry was sharp, piercing. I flinched, my gaze locking on the small face. And suddenly I was back in that terminal weeks ago, watching her, feeling her careful presence, hearing the soft rhythm of her voice. I watched strangers at gates, people waiting with nothing but time, faces drawn, hands empty, carrying their own quiet anxieties. And I realized how often we cross paths with lives we barely touch, but still, in some way, leave marks on one another. I thought about the key I had given her. The apartment, the blankets, the note. I remembered the hesitation, the nod, the weight in her eyes. And I wondered if I had done the right thing, or if the right thing was exactly what she had orchestrated all along. The baby's cry faded, replaced by footsteps, rolling suitcases, laughter, and hushed conversations. And yet, I was alone with the memory, alone with the quiet lesson she had left in me. That trust is fragile, and generosity is not measured in permanence, but in intent. I closed my eyes briefly and imagined her walking through some other street, some other world, carrying her careful calm with her. I realized I would never see her again. She had disappeared into the world the way she had intended, leaving only traces, only echoes. And yet, she was present in the way I now noticed small things. The pause of a stranger rocking a baby, the patience in a look, the quiet ways people hold themselves while waiting. Some meetings aren't meant to last. Some interactions are designed to shift something, leave a mark, and vanish. And this one had marked me in ways I couldn't measure. I thought about what I had gained. A deeper understanding of what it means to trust without knowing, to give without expecting, to act without witnessing the results. And I thought about what she had gained or preserved. Safety, freedom, the ability to continue moving through the world on her own terms. I wondered if, in some small way, she had saved me as much as I had helped her. The memory of her calm, of her careful patience, had taught me something I had never learned from books or words. Presence can be a gift, even when fleeting. I sipped the coffee in my hand, bitter but grounding, feeling the rhythm of the terminal, the movement of lives intersecting, and the quiet echo of a lesson learned too late but held forever. I stood and walked toward the gate, carrying only the weight of memory. The terminal was busy, faces blurred, announcements continuing, wheels rolling. A baby cried again somewhere. A mother adjusted a coat. I smiled faintly, softly, to no one, feeling the invisible threads of connection and departure. The lesson lingered. Some encounters are brief, some meetings vanish, but their marks endure. I pressed my hand lightly against the railing, letting the space around me settle. The city beyond the glass windows continued, endless and indifferent, but inside, I carried the quiet proof of trust, of care, of a life gently intersecting mine. And I whispered, barely to myself, did I save her, or did she save me? The answer didn't matter. The presence, fleeting and profound, had been enough.